Today, I want to talk about why responsible tech is a business imperative. Alternate title, Tech's Frankenstein moment and what it means for founders. Folks are familiar with the parable of Frankenstein. If anyone has thoughts, you could throw it into the chat. But Frankenstein ultimately is about being careful about what you create, because what you create could become the thing that ultimately destroys you. So I want to just give a little bit of a sense of how this talk is going to go. We've covered a good chunk of the intros, at least one-sided, so we won't spend too much time there. I have a quiz for you, excitingly. We'll talk very, very quickly about the current state of tech and society and how we got here, and what this means for founders specifically. I'll share a bunch of further resources if you wind up being interested in learning more, if I ultimately do a compelling job of making this case. And then I will make an additional plea, and then we'll jump into the Q&A. So intros, I guess somewhat sadly, this was going to start out as a video Zoom, and I was looking forward to meeting a number of you directly. But it seems like enough folks at least think that this is a worthwhile subject that we moved it to a webinar. That said, Tracy was thoughtful enough to share a bit about some of what you're working on, the backgrounds of some of the companies in your current batch, and it was really cool to read. Specifically, it seems like thematically, kind of social good is something that a lot of folks have already embedded in the things that they're trying to do. EcoCart, thinking about how to help folks offset their carbon footprint. AWSM, helping folks with financial literacy. Brave Credit doing the same. I feel like there are a bunch of companies in the batch profiles that seemed to explicitly be thinking about some type of social good and ultimately what they were trying to build, which was awesome. Hopefully we get to connect more intimately another time. I would love to chat with individual companies in the batches. On my side of the intro, I'm going to keep it super brief. I guess most importantly, I just want to establish my nerd bona fides right off the bat. This is an actual picture of my Jufro circa 2001. I wanted to be a physicist. I did wind up getting my degree in physics, but wound up realizing very early on that I would have been a mediocre physicist at best. And so spent most of my career, like Tracy said, kind of at the intersection of technology and social change, and mostly in education and K-12 education specifically, which is where my heart is and will always be. And more recently, kind of on the civic or political and advocacy side, as a co-founder of Swayable and teaching public interest tech at NYU. So now I'm gonna ask everyone's participation. There's this really cool K-12 exercise that we do called Fist to 5. Since I can't see your faces, I'm gonna ask that you throw in the chat. Fist to 5, or put in a number from 0 to 5, 0 being the least, 5 being the most. How positively has technology impacted you in your life individually? So throw a number in the chat. 0 is tech hasn't done anything for me, and 5 is tech has made my life wildly better. So just throw a number in the chat. Four, 3, 3, 4s. Cool. So seeing a lot of 3s and 4s. Where's everyone else at? Okay. So still, I want you to keep that number in your head, whether or not you put it in the chat. And now I would put the question to you, what kind of impact do you think technology has had on society, 0 to 5. So why don't you throw those numbers in there now? So some threes. So at this point, we're mixing it up a little bit. 2, so our first kind of low number. So really the point of this sort of like quick poll quiz thought exercise is really to just point out the difference in the way that technology has affected us individually and the way that it's affected society. So this is in all likelihood a technologically proficient group. So it's not surprising that the first number would be higher. But this disparity, I think this is a survey done by a really wonderful think tank out of the UK called That Everyone. But this disparity between our perception of how it's generally influenced folks in the technology community and how it's affected society at large is important to call out. I'd be curious if folks have any thoughts about why this disparity might exist. Please throw it in the chat. I think we're really at this point where there is a fever pitch of techno-skepticism, of backlash. It's a frightening time on a number of fronts. But this isn't sort of the first time where, as a society, we have questioned the benefits of technology, where folks have been fearful about whether technology was actually impacting the greater good. It goes all the way back and probably further to Socrates with the written word. Socrates was actually worried that the written word would create forgetfulness in learners' souls. But I think the curious question, or the kind of essential question for this group, for our community, for the tech community, is how far have we come? Does this moment feel different? What does it mean for entrepreneurs and for technologists and people working around technology? So I want to give an exceedingly abbreviated history of tech and society. So back in 2008, we were running high on the fumes of techno-optimism still. The iPhone had just come out. Obama had promised change. Facebook IPO'd. Everything was awesome. And now, 12 years later, holy crap, eternal hell flames. And really, though, when we think about this conflicting relationship that society has with tech, and maybe that it's had with some of us individually, like, I think it's really important to dig in. So what are some of the things that have happened over the last, decade or so, or over the last maybe 5 years in particular, that have contributed to folks being more fearful about the current state of technology? Well, for one, it's contributed to historical levels of political and social polarization. It's allowed meddling from foreign actors hostile foreign actors in American democracy. It's enabled the manipulation and duplicity around personal data. It's ultimately compromised the fabric of American democracy in a number of ways. It's pushed misinformation and conspiracy theories that have resulted in real violence offline. And meanwhile, it has, there are growing threats to the privacy and security of everyday citizens, which, not surprisingly, disproportionately affects vulnerable populations and Black and brown people specifically. And now you have this terrifying real life version of this Black Mirror security death robot thing. And for me, I'm just like freaking out and just like want to opt out of all of this. For me, this is as a technologist for whom technology has been overall wildly beneficial in my life, but ultimately I'm looking at what's around us and I'm personally freaking out. There are a lot of things broken right now. And the tech community, I think, needs a moment of introspection to think about what role we have played. And I think a lot of it comes back to this framing by the renowned technology historian Melvin Kranzberg, who said, technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. I'd love to see if folks have sort of interpretations of that quote in the chat. But kind of thinking through all of this, like coming back to you as early stage founders, what does this mean for you and your business? How should or could this realistically change the way that you approach your work on a day-to-day basis? And I think I've been a founder, launching something right now, and all these questions are painfully familiar to me when thinking about anything that feels peripheral, and say like responsible tech specifically. Entrepreneurs are already resource constrained. Maybe you're still trying to find product market fit. I know you're probably focused, hopefully not quite at the moment, but will be focused on making payroll. Maybe you think it's too early, and the things that you're building right now or working on right now won't ultimately have the sort of impact that we were seeing in some of the previous examples. Maybe you're like, it's really too hard to think about unintended consequences. What's the point? Maybe you're like, I think I care about this, but what can I do other than kind of my day-to-day business? And one that we hear a lot, I'm a SaaS business, or, I am building cloud software. What does this have to do with me? Well, I think here's what it has to do with all of us. These issues are not going away. The public has noticed and is fearful and distrustful of the technology community. They've seen the damage. So have regulators and folks in the public sector who understand the double-edged sword of the power of modern technology and bringing it more and more into our lives. And I think it's important to call out that in addition to the common examples of like big tech around the problems with Facebook or some of the problems with Google, we've seen companies like Airbnb, WeWork, Uber, and smaller companies like Clarify AI find themselves in some instances existential trouble because they didn't give enough forethought to a lot of these issues. Probably most critically for you, though, as an early stage founder, the tech talent has also noticed, and the tech talent also cares. This is also from a survey, a fascinating survey from Everyone out of the UK of tech workers. So nearly a third of tech workers have said that they've worked, or let's say a quarter, that's probably better. A quarter of tech workers have seen decisions that in their companies that have made them worried about the social consequences of the things that they're building. That's a crazy number. Even crazier number is almost 2/3 explicitly want more resources and want more time to think about the impacts of their products. And nearly 80% would love more practical resources to help them think about this stuff. So as you're building your company, these are long-term trends that will in all likelihood affect your day-to-day, and getting ahead of them is almost certainly a business imperative. More concretely, right? I think there are 4 motivations here. So the first is attracting and retaining talent. We all know talent is diverse talent in particular. Getting ahead of these issues and being thoughtful about them is a signaling mechanism to a degree. And increasingly we're seeing unprecedented walkouts at tech companies big and small, over bad behavior. There's also, we're also, I think, in a generation that is demanding more from the brands that they buy than ever before. And so there's opportunity to build, I think, consumer loyalty. If there's, or generate consumer loyalty, if you're working in some instance or interacting with the public sector or in areas that might be regulated, which is probably a wider range of issues than you might think. Doing the right thing can help you build social capital ahead of time so that you can interact with folks in other sectors, starting from a good place. And then I really think, I don't know about most importantly, but hopefully you've heard, I'd imagine you've heard, as an early stage founder, your most precious resource is your time. And I think one way to think about investing in responsible tech is as insurance. You pay a small premium each month to be deliberate and thoughtful about this stuff. There is upfront cost, but that upfront cost prevents massive, time-consuming, money-wasting, reputational destroying disaster down the line. So ultimately, I think the thing to know is these issues are not going away. This is where the puck is going. And so pretending that these issues don't exist, even if it makes our lives maybe a bit more complicated or challenging when they already are challenging, is just not the way to do it. It is not inadvisable. Being an ostrich is not the way to approach these issues. Okay, so you're convinced that this is an area of investment for you and for your company. Now what? Well, fortunately, there are a number of communities and conversations that are trying to build, or provide support or guidance for founders to do this work more effectively. And it turns out you have, I should say, founders and operators, executives and operators more broadly. And it turns out you have quite a bit of agency over these issues, even with the stage that you're at, even with the constraints that you're probably under. Just a quick selection, and this is just going to be kind of a fat list here, but there are frameworks for doing risk surfacing around social issues. There are frameworks for doing consequence scanning for unintended social consequences. Obviously, you should be investing, and I know 500 has pushed this, I think rightfully, making sure that you're hiring diversely, or at every level of your organization, that you're hiring diversely, that you're trying to source diverse investors, advisors, and so on. Public benefit corporations, if some of you have probably already incorporated, and shifting incorporation is a headache and a half, but the public benefit corporation structure is kind of equivalent to a C Corp or an S Corp, except it allows you to have fiduciary responsibility to your stakeholders. In other words, not just your shareholders, but kind of your employees, your customers, the surrounding community. It gives you more flexibility to be mission oriented. There are examples of kind of world positive funding terms. There are increasingly folks that do third-party ethical audits of your products. There are examples of folks building ethical advisory boards or ESG advisory boards. There are a growing number of examples of kind of usage policies for a product, or even kind of limitations on who you will sell to and under what circumstances. You could be thinking about how you hire. You bring people on who have specialization in some sort of socio-technical expertise and not just a technical expertise. Do you have a chief ethics officer, chief social responsibility officer, and so on? And then there's a growing number of opportunities for you to be trained and for you to train your team on some of these issues. Here's also just kind of a short selection of things that you could do, relatively low cost things that you could do right now as founders to help begin to embed some of this thinking into the DNA of your organizations. And I can share this list around later. I'd be curious, you can ask yourself right now how many of these boxes that you check. I would reiterate, I think, making an upfront investment in some of these areas right now, it may seem like a cost center, but it's really a cost savings. I think it's both a cost savings center and ultimately from a kind of a signaling and brand perspective, can help you can help bring top line value to the organization as well. So I just want to quickly share I think one important thing to call out is that this isn't a one-time, responsible tech isn't a one-time solution. You implement something once and forget about it. It's ongoing. It's something that you have to embed into your culture, into the DNA of the organization. And really importantly, there's an entire discipline dedicated to thinking about how tech impacts society, with standards and with rigor and with social science. And unless you've been trained I've really made a point to educate yourself, it's really unlikely that you're going to be able to kind of intuition your way out of this. Hear from some founders like, oh, if there were an ethical problem, I'd know, or we'd identify it. And it's like, well, what's your process for uncovering that? Like in the same way that you do experimentation around, to find your product market fit, it's worth a set of exercises and worth bringing on relevant expertise to meaningfully think about how your product or your organization actually impacts society. So here's one example. And I should say towards the end of the talk, I'm going to share, or in just a couple minutes, I'll share a bunch of the leading thinkers in that area who have thought really hard and for a long time about this critical intersection of technology and society. So this is just one example from that group.everyone that I mentioned out of the UK. They've categorized different types of unintended social consequences and have actually kind of listed prompts that you can go through either as a company or say as a product team, either your product team or maybe your business function can think through some of these things in a way that's a bit more intentional and deliberate. Here's another example of a really excellent framework out of Institute for the Future, which is a project funded called Ethical OS, which is a project funded by Omidyar, where they identified 8 risk zones that around unintended social consequences. And you can see here kind of their degree of rigor in thinking through, say, for example, what is surveillance state is the 5th risk zone. So just in this risk zone, for example, they have all these really thoughtful prompts about that you can use with your company to be thinking about, oh, are you maybe contributing to this type of unintended social consequence in ways that maybe you hadn't expected? So Kranzberg, who we quoted at the outset of the conversation, who said tech is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral, goes on to say this. And I think from my perspective, this is pretty uncontroversial. He says that technology's interaction with the social ecology is such that technical developments frequently have environmental, social, and human consequences that can go far beyond the immediate purposes of the technology devices and practices themselves. Of course, that's true. And so I kind of want to challenge all of us again as early stage founders. What is our, if taking that as a truism, what is our responsibility? We've kind of, I think, hopefully made a little bit of a case around the business imperative here, but I think it's clear that there's a societal one as well. And so ultimately, I think there are, three reasons why you should be thinking about how to embed responsible tech into the DNA of your organization, even at the stage that you're at. So first of all, like we said, there's upside. This sort of signaling, I think millennials and Gen Z in particular are more inclined to buy products, participate in communities that resonate with their own values than probably any generation ever before. And so from a talent perspective, from a consumer loyalty perspective, and from a broader social capital perspective, the more thoughtful you are about these things, there's real upside here for you. The second reason is hedging downside. I think it's really clear. I bet, I obviously can't speak for some of the tech executives that are getting beat up in the media these days, but I would bet that if you asked these folks what's the most, what they're most frustrated about in this experience, it is one, probably that they've created Frankensteins that to some degree, hopefully, or maybe they regret, but also these are vacuum sucks, right? In the edge case that you are successful and you create this thing that gets out of control, there will be a backlash, and that backlash is an enormous time suck for you. And to the extent that time is your most valuable asset, investing a little bit as you go in making sure there's not some disastrous event later on absolutely seems like kind of the prudent move here. I would also push on a bit more of a personal level, like, ask yourself, like, what outcomes you want from from what you're building, really, from all of this. And at what cost are maybe you willing to be, to have, to come upon some like massive exit? What do you really need financially? What do you really need to be happy? I think if there's been one positive to the pandemic for many of us, it's that hopefully maybe we've been able to spend more time with some of the people that we love, or we've been more in control of our own time. And I think for a lot of folks that may have been gratifying in ways that they weren't expecting. And so I would posit or kind of put to the group whether extreme wealth really should be kind of your aspiration through all this. Okay, so let's say you're convinced. Again, here are some folks that you should be paying attention to. There are, not surprisingly, I think a number of women, and in particular women of color, I think are thought leaders in the space because disproportionately, I think they've been on the backside of ways that tech has screwed things up. So folks like Safi Noble, who wrote Algorithms of Oppression ages before Tristan Harris at the Center for Humane Tech kind of started to make his case, is wildly brilliant and wonderful, and you should totally pay attention, I think, to the things that she's saying. Ruha Benjamin at Princeton is incredible. Kamal Sinclair at Guild of Future Architects is thinking about how to, thinking about a more intersectional futurism. All the other folks on this list are kind of thinking at this intersection of tech and society in really meaningful ways. And we can share the present, instead of going through them one by one, I'll share the presentation with Tracy to kind of send around. There are also a bunch of investors that are thinking about this meaningfully. 500, I want to call out. I think it's amazing that 500 Startups is being as deliberate and intentional about this in their community as they have been. I truly think establishing it as kind of a strategic pillar is going to be a really meaningful differentiator going forward. And I think everyone in the organization deserves credit for putting this stake in the ground. There's a bunch of other folks, both kind of institutional and angel, who really care about this stuff. And here are some of those names. Again, I'll kind of share the list around. The list is actually a lot larger than this, thankfully, but this is sort of an early list as you're maybe thinking about raising your seed. And then some other orgs who are thinking meaningfully about this. Ford Foundation has pushed a massive public interest technology initiative that's doing really wonderful work. Institute for the Future and Everyone, of course, with those frameworks that we shared. and a handful of other organizations up there that I think would be worth following. And then there's some frameworks, both for thinking about kind of responsible tech specifically, and maybe some folks have heard of BCorp, but I think I would make the case that technology is generally subordinate to the mission, values, business model, infrastructure that exists within the organization that contains it. And so we need to be thinking about responsible organizational design when we talk about responsible tech. This is actually the focus of my current work. And BCorp out of B Lab is a really terrific framework for thinking about that. So we're going to wrap up in just a second. Just kind of want to conclude with this quote. Don't be this person. Don't regret what you build. Don't count yourself out. Try to plan for the edge case in which what you're building turns out to be a wild success. And by the time it's a wild success is too big of a ship for you to turn in a meaningful way. There's a quote from one of Facebook's early executives. I feel tremendous guilt. I think we all knew in the back of our minds, even though we feign this whole line of there probably aren't any real bad unintended consequences. I think in the deep recesses of our minds, we kind of knew something bad could happen. Don't lose sleep. Don't be the person down in the future after this is successful, after your thing is successful, who ultimately regrets what you built. Don't be the person who lays awake at night with regret about your contribution in tech and society. So one final challenge before we wrap up. As you're building, I would really push you to, again, think about what you want out of all this, and really try to think about how we can collectively, and you can, with what you're working on specifically, ensure that the tech community is really ultimately helping to create a more just and prosperous and joyful world for everyone. So with that, I kind of sped through, but want to leave a bunch of time for questions. So thanks so much. If you want to continue the conversation beyond the next 20 minutes, you can find me there at Twitter. You're welcome to drop me an email personally. And I actually just launched myself, or not myself, with my amazing partner, Wineta Negron, what we're calling the Startup in Society Initiative, which I'll throw in the chat. Would love your feedback on. But again, it's the idea that kind of on the back of a lot of the Coinbase debate last month, I think it's already difficult to be a founder. And I think navigating this new socio-technical landscape, it can add even more complexity. But one, it's a business imperative. And two, it's not going away. And so I think founders need support and kind of actually tactically, how does that translate into how they run their business every day? And so we're doing interviews with dozens and dozens of influential founders and investors and operators who are really trying to push the envelope here and do the right thing in order to create an open source resource for founders who care about this stuff and provide support there. So I'll stop there, and would love to open it up for questions and group discussion. Tracy, did you want to come back and moderate, or?
Yes, happy to. Yeah, I would love to hear what your thoughts are, especially as I'm thinking through kind of developing more of a curriculum and more content related to these topics. For the founders who are in the audience, would just kind of love to gauge sort of your interests, about going deeper into any of these topics. So please feel free to share in the chat or email me directly as well, anytime. I guess one thing I'm curious about while we're waiting for people to engage is, this question of, how do you even start to think about some of these things? Because I know for a lot of companies, it can just seem overwhelming, especially at the early stages. And this is something that as 500's developing its ESG sort of approach and policy and practices, we're trying to get a handle on, because the goal is not really to add a layer of complexity, but to really sort of help guide and think through some of these things. So I'm kind of curious, Lyle, in your experience on as a co-founder and navigating some of this with Swayable, like what were some of the first things that you started to think about as you were sort of building your company?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, in the first place, I think this, again, it may be a bit too late for folks, but it could be just worth understanding. We made the decision to incorporate as what's called a public benefit corporation, which is a type of incorporation structure. In a traditional C Corp, S Corp, you have fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders. And in a public benefit corporation, you have fiduciary to your stakeholders, which includes just a broader group of folks that are ultimately affected by the things that you're building. And it gives you a bit more flexibility to do things like, think more meaningfully about how you let your product be used, or maybe by whom, or under what circumstances. It gives you the ability to maybe be more stringent in the terms with which you accept funding. And that was a kind of a really powerful first lever, but kind of beyond that, I think the low-hanging fruit is for sure. I would say there are two really pieces of really low-hanging fruit. So the first is an advisory committee. There are, I think everyone that's in 500 is almost is certainly building something that's going to interest a bunch of other people, and framing a really light touch way for diverse voices to have some sort of input or insight into the thing that you're building can be, I don't want to say straightforward, but is an easy win, right? People like serving on advisory boards or like being advisors. It doesn't cost you much really at all. And if anything, you're kind of widening the set of people that are invested in your long-term success. And so I would think about, okay, who are some of the folks that might have more, not just maybe a technical expertise or a business expertise in the thing that I'm building, but maybe like a societal one, and think about how to pull them into an advisory committee. I think is pretty low touch and fun. And then secondly, just running through the ethical OS exercise one time, or the consequence scanning exercise one time in one, either in one hour-long product meeting, or better yet, one weekend, or half a day offsite with your team, is going to yield insights that I think you will surprise you for sure. And so I'd say in terms of low-hanging fruit, it's kind of widening the tent in the first place. I think advisory is a great structure for that. And then second, there have been a lot of people who have worked really hard to kind of distill these into meaningful prompts. And the consequence scanning from Everyone, and the ethical OS from Institute for the Future, and the data ethics canvas, and there are a handful of others, are all really terrific tools that are worth running through at least once. And I bet will kind of give you maybe illuminate kind of maybe easy next steps or likely next steps for you to take kind of on this journey.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. We have a couple of questions from, I don't know if you can see the chat.
Yeah. I see from Bill Lessier. How do you think large corporations, open innovation, and corporate venture programs should or could make their programs purpose-driven, including social entrepreneurship? Great question. So kind of a mix here. You know, on the venture, I think I've seen large philanthropic efforts kind of at the corporate side, and then less common, I've seen kind of corp dev stuff that's impact oriented. I think most notably, I would call out Salesforce's new $100 million impact fund, led by Claudine Emiot, who's awesome, where they're thinking really meaningfully about this intersection. I think it's worthwhile for large companies. I think, again, they're really big ships to turn, and doing, say, like charitable work and sponsoring like a diverse STEM education program is really great, but not doing anything to address maybe like a problematic business model. So there are like multiple prongs in which I think to be really good corporate actors, big companies should be thinking about. And I definitely think kind of the charitable or supporting nonprofit is one, but I think less explored but also worthwhile is doing purpose-driven venture, and I've seen it much less. I do think when folks do that, it's worth pulling on folks who really do understand impact. Like there's an entire social sector of folks who really have an entire discipline and set of rigor around what it means to create positive social impact beyond just investing in an ed tech company. And I think for those conversations, it's super important to pull folks like that in at the early stages. Otherwise, I think you risk kind of making a lot of noise, but with not having a lot of impact. See, next question. Tracy, maybe I'll answer next question.
Yeah. Is there potential sort of workable examples of harmonious relationship between an innovative tech culture and regulatory framework? That's a good one.
That's a great question. I can give examples of one where I've seen it not work in ways that are maybe surprising. I think, I think Airbnb has done a lot of really wonderful things for sure. I think to some degree, they were surprised by the regulatory backlash that they faced in certain places. And I think subsequently, rightfully, have tried to get ahead of the puck, so to speak, and have invested considerably in kind of building relationships with the public sector to admit and address the obvious drawbacks of their expansion in certain zones, for example, right? Like pushing rent prices up, pushing long-term residents out, changing the compositions of neighborhoods. Like they acknowledge that is an unintended negative social consequence that they, don't want to see, right? And so being forthright and having that frank conversation and trying to balance that with, at the same time, making some places more affordable or accessible for visitors, is having frank conversations with the public sector. I feel like is on a subject like that, I think is the way to go. I'll say for companies like scooter companies, there are a handful of companies that are trying to do like last mile transportation in transportation deserts, which also have maybe kind of certain trade-offs around quality of life in certain places. Scooters in roads, scooters on sidewalks, people getting hurt, like scooters being left in certain places, causing accidents, affecting quality of life in I think ways that maybe they weren't anticipating, but also in some instances solving a meaningful social challenge that public sector isn't equipped to solve, like last mile transportation in transportation deserts. And so I can't think of I don't know of a company I can't think of an example of one of those companies that has or like a specific conversation where I think those interests were addressed and in like a balanced, thoughtful way. But I would think that really the way to do it is to just have a frank conversation, right? As a technology company, be like, look, we exist because we really think last mile transportation is important. we know, like, here's some of the social metrics that we're using to like evaluate that and how we think it can increase quality of life in your, you know, in your public purview. But we also acknowledge some of the drawbacks, right? So like, let's work together on thinking about how to hedge those in a more meaningful way. It's a really good question, Nick. I'll try to think about it and get back to you on something more specific.
And I guess something that might be useful in terms of wrapping this up, I would also like to hear about your experience. So you know, established yourself as a public benefit corporation. I'm wondering about your fundraising sort of experience and identifying investors, because many of our companies are obviously sort of at that stage where they're thinking about raising, you know, money, and, you know, in some cases might be somewhat apprehensive about, like, you know, the sort of, will it limit their ability to raise money? Will they actually find investors who sort of have this similar kind of thinking? So I'd just be curious to hear sort of what your own experience was at Swayable, but also like what else you're seeing as you're out and talking to a lot of these investors.
It's a great question. I think, you know, I'd love to give, I think ultimately the answer is optimistic, but I want to start in saying that there are some investors that aren't going to understand. And I think you would need to be prepared to say, like, well, if you don't, you know, I will not undertake this type of behavior to have this type of outcome. And if that's not what you're looking to invest in, then maybe this isn't a good match. And we did turn down some investments where that line around the sorts of impacts that we were looking to create, ultimately, there wasn't an understanding. And that was challenging. We did that when we didn't have any money yet. And it was really hard. It was really hard. But ultimately, I think the good news is there really is a growing community of people that care about this. And there is a growing number of investors that really care about this. And I think not only that are, say, willing to tolerate it, but who fundamentally believe that it's a competitive advantage for some of the reasons that we talked about. And so I think the more authentically you kind of build it into your DNA and signal it, you know, the more, I think the more attractive you'll be to kind of a new crop and a new wave of thinking in the investment community.
I agree. Well, Lyle's contact information is here, and I will also get a copy of the deck so that we can share it around. We've also made a recording of this session, which I'm happy to share with others in the 500 community who are interested in watching again. But thank you, Lyle. I want to really appreciate sort of you sharing your knowledge, your experience, and your insights. I'm super excited to continue the conversation along these lines. Next week, we have Alex Rosenblatt, who is the author of Uberland, where she's going to talk a lot about how early stage tech can shape the sort of gig economy, which is also another topic that's near and dear to my heart. And so again, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your experience and expertise. And I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much, Tracy. It really was a pleasure to be here, and just want to call out 500 for kind of the leadership that the leadership that you have on this issue. I think pushing these conversations at this time is really, really meaningful, and it's cool to see how much how seriously 500 is taking it.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for attending. Appreciate your participation. Till next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.